Hi everyone, I'm Gertie. Thank you so much for buying my book, Gertie's Charmed Sewing Studio. Today I'm going to be showing you how to sew one of the patterns in the book called the Camille Sheath. Now this design is based on an iconic design by one of my favorite mid-century designers, Alfred Shaheen. And I named it after his daughter, Camille, who's been a huge resource to me over the years. This design has a really interesting neckline feature, which includes interior elastic, we're going to show you how to sew today, and also some really beautiful pleated pockets on the skirt. In the video description, you will find handy links to each chapter of this tutorial so you can skip around to the part you're looking for. And you'll also find links to the videos for the other two patterns in the book, which are the Lillian jacket and the Madeline dress. You'll also find how to join our Charm Patreon, which is a subscription where you get a new vintage-inspired sewing pattern every month, along with a full sewing video tutorial like this one. You also get access to the incredible archive of patterns we have on there, which are appropriate for sewists of all skill levels. The first thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to take a look at the pattern pieces laid out on a surface so you can see how the pattern comes together. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so now we're going to look at the pattern pieces. And this is something we do in all of our tutorial videos for Charm and Patreon, is that we like to shrink the pattern pieces down to 25% for you, and then look at them together, talk about how the garment is constructed, and also talk about any marks that you may need to be aware of. So first, let's look at the bodice front. This is kind of unusual. You can see it's cut on the fold, and then the way the strap goes out to the side, the strap is cut on with the bodice. And this mark right here is very important because that is where your elastic gets attached. And once the elastic is in place, then this will go in the correct direction and a small pleat will be formed here. And so it looks sort of like a stretched out scoop neck now, but once the elastic is where it needs to be, it's going to be such a beautiful neckline with that pleat. And then note that you have a bust dart here, so you will want to mark that on your fabric. You have a notch here for matching up to your midriff, okay? So there is a midriff seam on the bodice front. So you're gonna cut one fabric on fold and one lining on fold for both the midriff and the bodice front. Now the bodice back does not have a midriff seam, so you're just going to cut the bodice back, two fabric, two lining. There's a seam down the center back where we will insert a lapped zipper. You have a dart on your bodice back and some notches for matching. This notch matches up to the midriff seam on the front, just FYI. And then our skirt pieces. For the skirt front, you have three pieces that you need to cut because of that beautiful pocket. So as you can see, the skirt front is a pencil shape cut on the fold. You're just going to cut one fabric on the fold because the skirt is not lined, but the bodice is. And you can see this slanted shape here. That's the upper edge of the pocket, okay? These three marks right here are for that pleat that we're going to show you how to make on the pocket. And make sure that you transfer that circle mark because that's important for matching these three pieces. Okay, so that's your skirt front. And then the next thing you want to make note of is that you have your pocket bag, okay? This is the piece that you're gonna cut two lining of. It finishes the upper edge of the pocket. So it gets sewn here and then turned to the inside. So this you can cut in lining, or if you have a thinner fabric, you can cut it in your fashion fabric if you prefer. Totally up to you. And then the third piece that you need to be aware of for the skirt front is the skirt side front. It has a dart in it, and you're gonna cut two fabric. Now this is what goes behind that slanted pocket to form the upper hip on your skirt. Okay, so these three pieces together form your skirt front with the pocket constructed. And then finally you have your skirt back, which is a lot more simple. You are going to cut two fabric. You have a back dart on this one, and then you're going to want to be aware of this mark. This is for the base of the zipper, okay? So you will stitch to here for your zipper. And then this mark is for the slit in the back, so you want to leave this open below that circle mark. Okay, so that's it. Not a ton of pattern pieces, but there's a few things you want to know before you get into cutting and marking. So next we're going to move on to talking about your fabric and supplies. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about fabric and supplies for your Camille sheath. So as always, with all these book patterns, you can go back to the book for our full list of recommendations, but we're just going to give you a few selections here. What you're looking for this dress are medium or lightweight woven fabrics, okay? You want to avoid knits for this project. And here are a few ones that I think could be really great. First of all, a cotton is a great choice for this dress, especially like a tropical print would be very much in the vein of the original Shaheen sheath. So you could just do a cotton broadcloth. This polka dot would be so cute. The one that we're going to be sewing on video today is a linen and rayon blend in a floral. So this one is really nice. You're looking for something that has a little bit of sturdiness to it, but is not too stiff. So for more dressy fabrics, you could do something like this embroidered shantung, which is so cute, little gingham with rosebuds on it. Or a brocade could also be really nice. This is a poly brocade. And then finally, if you want to do something with a little stretch in it, not a knit, but a woven with a little bit of lycra woven in, that would be fine. This is a cotton sateen. This dress would be so beautiful in a solid as well. So keep something like that in mind. And then you would have the stretch going widthwise around your body just for a little extra give as you wear it. You are also going to want some fusible interfacing. So some of my favorites for garment sewing are lightweight woven, weft, or tricot. You want to be avoiding a non-woven craft interfacing. Those are much too paper-like and they get very, very stiff and heavy. So you're going to be avoiding craft interfacing and non-woven interfacing. Finally, you want thread to match your fabric color. So we always use all-purpose polyester thread for all of our garment sewing in the Charm Studio. You will want a machine needle to match the weight of your fabric. I love Microtex needles because they're very sharp and they work on a lot of different fabrics. You could also use a universal. And keep in mind that you will want the size of the needle to match the weight of your fabric. So 70-10 to 80-12 should be about in the right range for this dress. You'll need a 14-inch regular zipper. So for that vintage look, I always do lapped zippers in dresses. So you want a regular zipper with the teeth on the right side rather than an invisible zipper where the teeth are hidden. Okay, so keep that in mind. And you'll be looking for the standard zipper pull as well. An invisible zipper will have a teardrop. That's how you can tell the difference. And then finally, you'll need some 1/4-inch elastic for that neckline detail. And you can look in the book for the chart, the elastic measurement chart, to figure out how much you need for your size. And keep in mind that that is just a guideline. You may need to adjust later on in the fitting process to fit your body. So that is all the fabric and supplies for the Camille sheath. And now we can get started sewing. Okay, so Andrea is sewing for us today. Thank you so much, Andrea. You can see that she has already stay stitched the neckline using a 1/2-inch seam allowance. So she has stay stitched directionally from each shoulder to center front and overlapping at center front. And if you're following along in your book, and I hope you are, this is step 1. And she's repeated that process on the bodice backs. It's just a straight across neckline on the back, just stitching in either direction at 1/2 inch. And you can also see that we have marked in our darts using a wax tracing paper, so it's nice and dark. So we have bust darts and then the 2 darts marked in on the bodice backs. And also we have already applied interfacing to the center backs. So that should be an 1.25 inch wide strip of fusible interfacing at the center backs, which will stabilize the center back in preparation for inserting your lap zipper so it doesn't stretch out as you insert your zipper. Okay, so next we're going to focus on sewing the bust darts. And we're going to take you through step by step on this. We want you to see every step of sewing this dress. So what we're going to do first is we're going to pin and then sew one of the bust darts. So you can see that we have it marked in. And one thing we like to do is make little clips on the legs of the darts at the side seams so that you can then match those little clips. That can be very helpful for matching. So we're folding our dart in half, right sides together, and you can match little clips at the side seam and put 1 pin at the point of the dart. And then pinning is so important for sewing darts. You want to make sure that your marked lines are right on top of each other so that you're sewing the dart exactly as it was drafted in the pattern. So you're going to place your pin through top to bottom. Oh, and you want to place your pins directionally so that you're going to be sewing from the side seam. So you want the heads of your pins to be closer to the point of the dart so that you can pull them out easily as you're sewing them. So the pointy ends are facing the legs of the dart or the side seam. So what we're doing is we are placing the pin top to bottom through the fabric. You're inserting it exactly on that marked line and then checking the back to make sure that the pin is exactly going through the marked line. And that's how you'll know that you are stitching the dart exactly as intended. Okay, so place a few pins up the leg of the dart, and then you're ready to stitch. So you've got your sewing machine set on about 2.5 millimeters long for your stitch length. And starting at the side seam, at the raw edge, you're going to start stitching and then back stitch. You can back stitch on this end, but you don't want to back stitch on the point because that can leave a little pucker. So back stitch here and then just very carefully sew up the leg of your dart as you pinned. And now you can see a little bit better the direction that your pins are going, how it makes it easier to pull them out as you're stitching if the heads are closer to the point. And when you're sewing a dart like this, you want to be really careful at the point of the dart. That's where you can get puckers or little bubbles. So it's really important that your final couple stitches are right on the edge of the fabric, just parallel to the fold. And then just very carefully stitching off. You don't want to be stitching without fabric underneath your needle when you're sewing on a regular sewing machine. So, because then it can get twisted and create knots between the bobbin and the upper thread. So just make sure that you're just stitching to the very edge of the fabric and then pulling the work out of the sewing machine. Now you can tie off the ends. Make sure that you've left yourself a couple inches here to tie off. Give it a double knot to secure it. And then you can trim those threads close to about 1/4 inch is fine. And you can see that Andrea has pulled out our iconic cat ham from the Charm Studio. And we're going to use that for pressing. It's really important to use a curved surface when you're pressing darts because we have created some curve in the shape of the fabric. So we want to make sure that we're pressing on a curved surface. If you try to press it on a flat surface, you will get bubbles and ripples around the point of the dart. You're going to be pressing the bust darts down towards the bottom of this piece, away from the straps. And then just give it a little steam at the point, and then check on the right side to make sure that you're happy with your pressing, and you can always go back and press a little bit more. I always say to take your time with pressing darts because you really want to make sure that they look nice and smooth. And now, of course, we're going to repeat the same thing for the other bust dart, as well as for the 2 back waist darts on the bodice backs. So exact same process as we did on the first bust dart. And it's important to note that any vertical darts, like these back waist darts, always get pressed towards center front or center back, respectively. We're working on a back piece, so that means we're going to press these darts towards center back. And we can easily tell which side of the piece is center back because we have already done our strips of interfacing. So press your darts towards your interfacing. And then we'll be ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so now we are to step 3 in our book instructions. So what we're going to be doing is sewing the bodice to the midriff. So you want to make sure that you have your little notches clipped at the seam where they meet. And then we're going to pin them right sides together and stitch this seam. So you can see we have our notches marked in and clipped. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by pinning at our match points, so notches and side seams, and then filling in pins in between. And that'll help you ease these two slight curves together. So pin those notches first, then go to the side seams. And just want to note, it may look like you have an extra corner sort of hanging over the side seam here, but what you should see is that if you took a ruler and measured in 5/8 of an inch to the seam line, that at that point your two pieces would match. So you have a little extra corner, but then at that 5/8 of an inch seam line, your two pieces are matching perfectly. Then just fill in any pins in between your match points. And now we're going to stitch this at 5/8 of an inch. So using your 2.5 millimeter long stitch length, you're going to backstitch at the beginning and at the end of this seam. And you're using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, taking out your pins as you go. Okay, now we're going to trim down these seam allowances and then press them up towards the bodice, towards the neckline. So it's worth noting you do not need to finish these seam allowances because this bodice is fully lined. So all of these raw edges are going to be completely enclosed. So you don't need to worry about any serging or zigzagging or pinking or whatever you normally do to finish your seam allowances. We are going to grade the seam allowances though, which means cutting one seam allowance narrower than the other so that you don't have two seam allowances right on top of each other. So you're going to cut the midriff seam allowance first, and you can cut it down to about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch. So that's going to be the shorter one. And then the bodice seam allowance, you can cut a little bit wider, about 1/8 of an inch wider than the midriff one. So then you have a little beveled edge rather than two seam allowances right on top of each other when we press them in the same direction. So this is a great place to use a ham too, just because it has a little curve to it. It's also just nice to elevate as you're pressing. It kind of helps isolate the seam that you're pressing. So we're pressing up towards the neckline. And that's it for this seam. No need to finish or do anything else here. And the back doesn't have a midriff seam, so we're going to be going to the side seams next. And there we have it. We can see this beautiful floral from the right side. It's starting to look like a bodice. Okay, now we're up to step 4, sewing our side seams. So you're gonna take each bodice back and you're gonna put it right sides together at the side seam with the bodice front. So make sure that you are pinning the side with the notch, not the side with the interfacing. So you have a notch that will match, the notch is on the bodice back and it will match the midriff seam on the bodice front. As you're pinning, make sure that your midriff seam stays pressed up and your bust dart stays pressed down. So you probably want to pin those points in place so that they don't accidentally go in the wrong direction as you're stitching them. So pin from top to bottom, pin your match points, and then fill in pins in between, just like we did on that midriff seam. That's a good practice to get into in general, is always starting your pinning at the important match points, whether it's a notch, a seam that matches, and then the two ends, and then filling in pins in between. And then you shouldn't find that you have any excess as you're trying to pin those two pieces together. Okay, so now we're ready to stitch at 5/8 of an inch. Again, that regular stitch length is 2.5 millimeters, and you're back stitching at each end. And now we're going to press these seam allowances open. So you don't really need a ham for this because it's easy enough to press this flat on a flat surface on your ironing board. And there you go, a pressed open seam. You're going to do the same thing on the other side seam, and then we're ready to move on to the elastic. Okay, so next what we're gonna see Andrea do is attach the elastic to the neckline of the dress. And this is that really clever feature that Alfred Shaheen came up with for this sheath, where it creates this illusion of a pleated neckline that moves with you. And it's really simple to sew, but it's a very elegant detail. And it's really just basting the elastic to the neckline, and then it's gonna get sandwiched in between the fabric and the lining. And that's all there is to it, but you get this beautiful vintage detail. So let's watch Andrea do that now. Okay, so looking at step 5 in your instructions, we have done all of the same steps on your lining pieces. So our outer dress is a beautiful floral linen, and so we're using a lightweight cotton lawn in this lovely violet color for the lining. So just repeating all the same steps, 1 through 4, that you did for the outer dress on the lining. And now we're ready to move on to step 6, which is very exciting, and it's what makes this dress what it is. These elastic inner stays that attach the neckline and then continue to the back dart to create that flexible pleat at the neckline. So you're going to look at the elastic chart on page 178 and cut 2 lengths of elastic according to your size. Now, I will say those are approximations and our very best approximations after making many, many tests of this dress. But if you're worried that you have a longer bodice or a longer torso, you may want to give yourself an inch or 2 extra on those elastic lengths. So what we're looking at now is that there are 2 circle marks at the neckline, and Andrea marked them on the wrong side of this bodice. You can see them right there. But we're going to pin the elastic on the right side of the bodice, okay? So just matching one end of the elastic to where your circle mark is, with the other end of the elastic facing down to the waist. This may feel a little weird. Those 2 ends are gonna remain loose for now, and then we're going to sandwich the elastic in between the bodice and the lining. And then it's going to get tacked to the back waistline to create this sort of diagonal stay with some tension and flexibility to create your neckline pleat. But what we're going to do now is baste the ends at the neckline in place. So you've just pinned them, and it's really important that now you want to machine baste them so that they stay exactly where they are for the next steps. So you can even use, I said based, but you can even use your regular stitch length, which would be 2.5, because it's such a short little length of elastic or width of elastic that you don't want it to move around. So you can use your regular stitch length and back stitch at each end, which you wouldn't normally do for basting, but we really want to have some security with this tiny little area here. And if you used a long stitch length, it might kind of wiggle out of place. And also that back stitching gives you a little extra security too. So use a 1/2 inch seam allowance here so that it's right on top of your stay stitching where you're stitching. And that's it. We're ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so now we're on to step 7, and we're actually going to do step 7 in a couple different steps here. So we're just doing the first part here, and then we'll come back in the next chapter to do part 2. So first we're going to focus on the neckline, and then in the next step we'll worry about the armhole. Okay, so just break this down into some manageable little steps here. We are putting the lining and the dress right sides together at the neckline, and you can start pinning at your circle marks where the elastic will be sandwiched in between the two. And now go ahead and fill in pins in between those two circle marks. And then your next pins you can do at the short end of the straps. And then continue to just match up those two pieces. This area does have a little bit of stretch to it, right? Because it's slightly on the bias, and that's why we do those lines of stay stitching. So if you see things aren't matching, just use your fingertips to slowly press them together, back together, and use lots of pins, and you will be able to match them easily. You could see how the linen looked like it stretched just a little bit more than the cotton lining. So what we're doing is pinning them, making them match at the shoulder seam, and then just sort of pressing, and as Andrea was saying, massaging the two together, which made me laugh. So you can massage your pieces together a little bit, use lots of pins, and you will be able to get them to match. Better to do that than to have a little bit hanging off the end. And what we're going to do here is just pin the short end. I was noticing in the book instructions, it tells you to do the short end of the strap in the next part when you do the armhole. It really doesn't matter which order you do it in. So here we're doing the short end along with the neckline, which is a totally fine, acceptable way to do it. You could also wait and do this when you do the neckline, or the armhole, excuse me, in the next step. So either way, as long as you do them, is you do those short ends at one point. Okay, so what we're going to do now is stitch these two together. Make sure that your elastic ends are hanging down in between the two layers. And what we're doing is we're stitching the short ends at 5/8 of an inch, pivoting at that seam allowance. So you want to make sure that you're exactly at 5/8 when you pivot. So you can swing it around and double check and go back if you need to. And now we're stitching all the way around the neckline at 5/8 of an inch to the other short end of the strap. Those short ends of the strap are going to get hand stitched inside the dress to the back neckline. So we finish them now and they'll have a nice finished look on the inside, but they're just going to be hanging out for the next few steps. And now we're going to go back to grading. So hopefully you remember grading from our midriff seam. We are going to trim the seam allowances to different widths. The lining will be your shorter one, so you can trim this down. It's great to use small scissors like Andrea is using. These are the 5-inch Kai scissors, Kai, which is our favorite brand in the Charm Studio. Not an endorsement, just we really love them. So you can just stitch them down to about a quarter inch, 1/8 of an inch, that lining seam allowance. And then the dress itself will be slightly wider, so about 1/8 of an inch wider than your lining seam allowance. And then you're also going to want to clip those seam allowances since it is a curved seam allowance. About every 1/2 inch around the curves. And now we're going to understitch. So if you need a brush up on understitching, we do have a separate YouTube video on that. But what we're doing here is we are pulling the lining away from the dress, so pulling those 2 layers apart and isolating the seam line. And then you're stitching on the lining side of the seam about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line. And you're making sure, the most important thing about understitching is that you want to make sure that the seam allowances are underneath where you're stitching. So you might not be able to tell, but what Andrea is doing is feeling as she goes, she's holding the 2 layers taut away from each other, but then also feeling to make sure that both seam allowances are underneath where she's stitching so that the seam allowances are getting caught in the stitching. And you want to make sure that your elastic lengths stay pressed down towards the bodice. And just go as far as you can towards that little short end. And now we're going to press the neckline. So the understitching is going to help you sort of roll the lining seam allowance out towards the edge to get a nice little crisp edge, which will give you a really professional look on your neckline. So turn those little strap ends out if you stitched the strap ends already, and then use your fingertips to just press the lining edge out to the lining understitching. Use your fingers to press it out towards the edge. And then you're going to press. And continue that all the way around the neckline. And when you get to your elastic lengths, make sure that they are turned in to the lining, and then you can press over them. Make sure you're not using incredibly high heat on your elastic or holding it for too long because you can melt elastic, so just be careful there. You can also use a press cloth if you're worried. Elastic does degrade pretty easily, which is why the elastic in these vintage Shaheen sheaths never withstood, is that a word? Withstood the test of time. So you do want to be careful when you're handling elastic. It will stretch out over time, it will melt easily, and it will certainly dry rot in weather conditions. So if you're storing this in your attic, your basement, you might see the elastic degrading. Okay, so now we have a nice pressed neckline. And in the next chapter, we'll move on to part 2 of step 7, which will be the armhole. Now we're ready to move on to part 2 of step 7. So you're going to flip the lining back so that we are right sides together again, and turn the short end of the strap wrong side out again. And now you're going to match up right sides together, the underarm and the back neckline. We're going to do this in 2 stages, one side and then the other. So one thing we're going to focus on in this chapter is not only stitching and understitching the underarm and back neckline, but also doing what we call at Charm the clean finish at the back neckline, which is a really beautiful professional finish for a lapped zipper. So we're going to walk you through this step by step. If you've watched any of our videos before on YouTube or Patreon, you know that this clean finish is a signature method of ours here at Charm. So we are pinning along the strap, the other long end of the strap, matching the underarm seams, the side seams, and the back neckline, just matching as you go. And then a few more pins on the back neckline, that straight upper back neckline. And now we're going to focus on our clean finish for the left side or the overlap side of the bodice, overlap side of the zipper. So the lining is going to get turned in at center back 7/8 of an inch. So use your ruler, finger press it in at the upper neckline edge. So you're folding it separately from the dress itself and pin it in place there. So fold it in 7/8 of an inch. And you just turned it towards you and pressed it back towards the lining. Now you're going to turn the dress seam allowance so that it's nested over the lining seam allowance, but it gets turned in 5/8 of an inch. So you can see Andrea's really using her ruler, double checking everything here. And because one is 7/8 and one is 5/8, you're going to have a 1/4 inch gap between the two. All right, so that's what you're looking for at the top, is you want just a little space between those seam allowances at that upper edge. So just pin those seam allowances in place there. And then we'll move on to showing you how to pin the other side, because it's a little different on the other side. So the right side, as you're looking at the dress from the back, this is the underlap side of the lap zipper. And we're going to fold it slightly differently. So you can start by matching your side seam and placing a pin. You match your notch. And then just fill in pins along the strap edge. Okay, now we're going back to center back to focus on that clean finish method. Now, on the right side, as you're looking at the back, our underlap side, both of these seam allowances, the dress and the lining, get folded together. So fold them towards you. Make sure your lining is on top as you're doing this, by the way. Fold them towards you 1/2 inch, okay? And they're both folded the same amount, unlike the other side. So they're turned towards you 1/2 inch and pinned in place. So those two seam allowances are nested within each other, wrapped around each other, okay? And that's all there is to it. So on the first side, the left side as you're looking at it, we had 5/8 of an inch and 7/8 of an inch. And then on the right side, both seam allowances were 1/2 inch. We're starting at the fold where we turned in the seam allowances 1/2 inch on the right side of the bodice. And now we're stitching around the armhole and up the length of the strap. Okay, now as you might guess, the next thing we're gonna do is grade our seam allowances here. So you're gonna wanna trim across that back corner on the diagonal here. And now you're going to trim your lining down. So the lining seam allowance will be the narrower one. Oh, and here's a little hot tip from Andrea, is that your notch is where the shoulder strap is going to be placed, but we're going to trim the notch away on the next step. So you can just add a circle mark and transfer it to the right side of the fabric. And we're using, I love these pens that have air-soluble ink on one side, which means that they just fade after a couple days or even within 24 hours after just being exposed to air. So those are great because that mark will disappear. So just transfer that mark to the right side of the lining so that you know where to place your strap. And now we are trimming down the seam allowance of the lining to about 1/8 of an inch or a little bit wider. And then the dress seam allowance will be slightly wider. And so you're trimming around the back neckline, around the armhole curve, and then up the side of the strap that we just stitched. And now we're going to clip around the curve of the armhole. So use small sharp scissors and just use the point of the scissors to clip into the seam allowances, being careful not to cut into your stitching. And now we're ready to understitch the back neckline and the armhole. So flipping the lining out from the dress and making sure that your seam allowances are pressed towards the lining. Now we'll start understitching. You won't be able to get all the way to the back neckline corner because of our clean finish seam allowances. But start just a little bit in and back stitch. And stitch around the back neckline, understitching, just holding those two layers taut away from each other and using your fingers to check that your seam allowances are underneath your stitching. Now you're not going to be able to get very far into your strap. So you're going to do the back neckline, you're going to go around the curve of your armhole, and then you're going to go as far as you can up the strap, but it's going to get real tiny in there. So you're going to have to stop at a certain point. Now you're going to turn the strap right side out. So just pull it out using your fingers, or you can use a knitting needle or something kind of blunt to poke out the strap. And now we're ready to press this flat. So we only have understitching on one side of the shoulder strap, which is totally fine, but you still want to use your fingers to manipulate it so that the lining is not going to show from the right side, meaning that you're going to kind of use your fingers to press the lining away from the edge a little bit here, and then press with the iron. And then you'll have your understitching to help you press around the back neckline and the armhole. And now you would repeat this step on the other side, the other armhole and back bodice / strap. And then we're going to be ready to move on to our next step, which is actually the skirt. So you have half a dress already, which is amazing. All right, so there's that beautiful back neckline and underarm, all pressed, understitched, and ready to go. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is to sew the pocket pleat. I love this detail. It's one of those vintage details that you just really don't see in contemporary clothing. It's really small, but it adds a beautiful element to the skirt with these structured pockets. So you're gonna see that it's a little unusual in the construction is that we're going to form a pleat in the pocket, and then we're going to attach the pocket bag to finish off the upper edge of the pocket. So you'll see how that's done in the next chapter. Okay, so now we are on to the skirt, and this is step 8 in your book instructions. So you can see that we've already sewn one pleat, which happens at the top of the skirt, the waistline. And here's what it looks like from the right side. It's a little unusual, this pleat, because it's folded towards center front, and usually pleats get pressed towards the side seam. So this is a fun little vintage detail taken directly from one of these Shaheen sheaths. And I love how it looks having the pleat right where the pocket begins. So one is already basted in place, and we're going to show you how to do the other pleat. So you will have notches at the top of your pleat lines, and then you're going to fold them together. And you're going to want to do this looking at your pattern piece because we've given you an arrow for which direction to fold the pleat in. And generally, you want to be folding this from the right side of the fabric. I do realize we're looking at the inside now, but if you're going to be following the pleat lines and the arrows, you want to do it from the right side of the fabric. But just pin those lines together, and then you can check yourself, make sure that on the right side of the fabric, your fold is facing the center of the dress. So you're going to pin that pleat in place at the upper edge, and now we're going to baste it. So you can use your longer stitch length here, or because it's such a short little pleat, you can just keep your regular stitch length on, doesn't really matter. Just baste the pleat in place within the seam allowance at about 1/2 inch. So there are your 2 pleats formed. Okay, so this is part 1 of step 9. I was a little sneaky and put a few different steps into step 9. So the first thing we're going to do is sewing the darts on the skirt side front. Now, we didn't want to have multiple pleats on top of each other, so the shaping in the skirt side front comes from a dart rather than a pleat. So we've already sewn some darts in this video on our bust and waist darts on the bodice. So it's the exact same idea. You are going to fold the piece right sides together, place a pin at the point of the dart and where your notches on the legs match. And then you're going to pin up the leg of the dart, making sure that your marked dart lines are aligned perfectly from top to bottom. And again, the point of the pin should be facing away from the point of the dart, so that when you go to sew it, it'll be easy for you to pull the darts out by the head or the ball. Okay, so you're backstitching on one end and leaving tails at the point, and then tying those tails off. And now we're going to press the dart towards center front using a ham because it is a curved surface now. So you're going to want to press towards the curved edge, the curved side of this piece with a lower curve. The other side is the side seam or the hip curve. Use a little steam on that. And then we're ready to move on to sewing the skirt center back. Okay, so this is the second part of step 9. So we're looking at the 2 skirt backs from the wrong side. And you can see that just like we did on the bodice backs, we have reinforced the center back opening from the waistline down to the zipper circle with 1.25" wide strips of fusible interfacing. This is where our zipper is going to end. It's going to continue from the neckline down to that zipper circle. So we want to make sure that our fabric is reinforced and stabilized for the entire length of the zipper. And now you're going to place the 2 skirt backs right sides together. And you're going to place a pin right at your zipper circle. That's where we're going to stitch to, because we want to leave it open at the zipper opening. And then your next pin should be at the mark for the slit. There is a slit on the center back seam at the hem for walking ease, because this is a fitted pencil skirt. So there will be a slit from that circle down to the hem. So we're just going to be stitching between these 2 circles. So you're going to pin them first, the circles, and then you're going to fill in pins in between the circles, and then we're going to stitch. Okay, so we're starting at the slit circle here. You're going to backstitch on both ends of this little seam here. And then continue stitching at 5/8 of an inch using your regular 2.5 millimeter stitch length. And you can see we're ending right at the zipper circle and backstitching there as well. And now we'll press these seam allowances open, and you can continue to press the seam allowance in all the way down to the hem. So we're turning in the slit edges as well. And then you don't really need to worry about the zipper opening right now. Okay, so there's your skirt back. Now we'll move on to the skirt front. Okay, now we're moving on to step 10 in the book instructions. So you're going to want to grab your pocket bag and make sure that you have the circle marked in at the waistline there, because that's going to be an important mark for us. And you can see we have it marked on both sides here. And on the wrong side, you want to interface the upper edge of your pocket bag using an 1.25" wide strip of fusible interfacing again. And this will keep the pocket from stretching out as you're wearing the dress. Now you're going to start pinning at that circle mark. And that's where we're going to start stitching to. So don't stitch before the circle mark. You're going to start stitching exactly at the circle. And you're going to pin along that angled edge here, where the interfacing is. And now we're going to stitch these together. So start at your circle mark again. Very important, that little circle. So you're going to start stitching exactly on the circle, backstitch to the circle, and then continue stitching along this edge, backstitching at the other end. And now we're going to grade these seam allowances. So the pocket bag will be the shorter or the narrower seam allowance. Trim that down to about 1/8 of an inch. And then the skirt front will be the wider one. So about 1/4 inch or a little bit wider. And then the pocket bag will get flipped to the inside of the skirt front, and that'll be a nice finished edge there. But to make it look very nice and finished, we are first going to understitch. So going to your machine and just folding the pocket bag away from the skirt, holding those two layers taut away from each other, making sure that your seam allowances are underneath your stitching here. You're going to understitch from your circle mark to the side seam. Stitching on the lining, or the pocket bag, I should say, about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line. And this is going to help you get a nice crisp edge, and the lining will stay folded into the inside of your pocket bag. Okay, so now we're going to press, and you can see the circle mark there. You may need to just clip to the circle mark so that then you can turn out those seam allowances. And press that upper edge of the skirt, the pocket upper edge, kind of rolling out the understitching. And there you have a nice finish pocket edge. Okay, so now we're moving on to step 11 in the book. So we're going to be sewing the pocket bag to the skirt side front around this curved lower edge. And this is what actually creates the bag of the pocket, so that when you put your hand in your pocket, it doesn't go all the way through. It forms a actual functional pocket. So you're going to put that skirt side front on top of the pocket bag, matching that lower curve. And you're going to pin it. Now, keep in mind here, we are just working on these two layers. You never, on this step, you don't want to be pinning through to the skirt front. You're just pinning these two inner pocket bag layers together. So that's the skirt side front to the pocket bag, pinned around this lower curved edge and the side. But don't worry about the side seam yet. You're going up to the waist, but you're leaving the side seam free. Now, this curved edge, the inner curved edge should match exactly, okay? But the side seam is going to look like it's not going to match, and don't worry about that. We're going to make it match later to form that ease. Okay, so now we are stitching at 5/8 of an inch, 2.5 millimeter stitch length around that curved edge, back stitching at both ends. Okay, so you can see where we've stitched here and left the side seam free. And now we're going to match at the waistline. You're going to match your circle marks, okay? So the pleat and the dart are going to be on top of each other. The circle marks are all matching, stacked on top of each other. And then you're going to pin that little section in place. And then you're going to go to the side seam. So you're going to see that there will be a notch on all three layers here, the skirt front, then the pocket bag, and the skirt side front. You'll have a notch on all three of those layers that should match. So match those up, and what you're going to find is that you're going to be building in ease to the pocket. If you look at the photos of this dress in the book, you'll see that the hips are quite built up. And that's a really beautiful vintage structural look that I love. And that's what we're building here, is that excess ease that's going to create that sculptural look. So you're going to match everything on the side seam through those three layers and pin in place. And now we're going to baste those layers in place at the waist and at the side seam. And you can see here there's that extra ease that we're talking about, okay? So that's what you want to see, is a little bit of excess in the pocket itself. So basting the side seam and basting the waistline edge. And now we'll be able to move on to our next step of sewing the skirt side seams. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to step 12. following along in your book instructions, which is sewing the skirt side seams. So you're going to put your skirt back unit on top of your skirt front unit. And remember that notch we were just talking about when we were matching the 3 layers of the skirt front? There is the same notch on the skirt back. So you're going to match that notch to the ones on the skirt front and pin there first. And again, like we've talked about, you're going to pin your match points first, right? So first that notch, then the upper waistline edge, and then the hem edge, and then fill in pins in between. And now we're ready to sew our side seam. And we're going to be using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance with a 2.5 millimeter stitch length as usual. Sew all the way down to the lower edge. And now you'll want to use a ham here. It doesn't have to be a cat ham, but bonus points if it is, to press your hip curve. And the seam allowances of the pocket layers will get pressed towards the skirt front. And then once you are out of the woods on the hip curve, then you're below the hip, it's a pretty straight seam, so you don't need to use the ham all the way down. So just continue pressing open all the way down to the hem. And you're going to repeat that on the other side seam, pressing just like you did, and then you'll have a fully complete skirt. And next we're going to sew this to the bodice at the waistline seam. So we are on to step 13 in the book. So this is going to be attaching the bodice to the skirt. So you're going to put the bodice right sides together with the skirt at the waistline edge, and just make sure that the lining of the bodice stays free. So you can kind of flip it down like Andrea has done here. And again, we're going to start by matching key points. The side seams, darts are really important. Any circle marks, notches, etc. So you're going to also make sure that your darts stay folded in the direction that we pressed them. So think about those bodice darts that we press towards center back. You want to make sure that they stay pressed towards center back. So you can just use an extra pin there just to make sure that they are very secure. And we're just pinning all the way around the waistline, the upper edge of the waistline. And you'll have some notches to match to your skirt here. And one thing to note is that we have serged our seam allowances on the skirt. Before we even started assembling them, we like to just flat finish the raw edges of the skirt without removing any seam allowance. And that's because the skirt is not going to be lined. So you want to make sure that you do something to finish those seam allowances. Okay, so now we are stitching 5/8 of an inch all along the waistline, making sure that all our darts stay pressed where they're supposed to, etc. Now remember, the bodice seam allowances don't need to be finished because it's fully lined, so it's going to be completely enclosed and clean finished on the inside there. So if you haven't thought about your skirt seam allowance finishes, now would be a good time. You can use a serger, you can pink them, use a zigzag stitch, but do something to make sure, especially with a linen like this, you can see how much it's fraying on those seam allowances. You just want to make sure that you're doing something to prevent that fraying in your skirt. Now we're going to grade our seam allowances. The seam is going to get pressed up towards the bodice. So you'll trim the skirt seam allowance so that it is narrower. Trim it down to about 1/4 inch is fine here. And then the bodice seam allowance will be slightly wider. About 3/8 of an inch would be a good width for the next one. I don't like to trim too close on a waist seam line because you do get a lot of movement there. So I wouldn't recommend ever trimming any shorter than 1/4 inch on a waistline. And now we're going to press the seam towards the bodice. It can be handy to use your ham here because there is some curve built into the waistline. And now you have what looks like a dress. And next we are going to insert the zipper, and then we'll have some finishing work. Okay, now we're ready to move on to step 14, which is insert a lap zipper at center back, which is all the book says. So we're gonna really take you in depth here, and this step will be in 2 parts, okay? So we're gonna start with doing the underlap of the zipper. And that's the right side as you're looking at the back of the dress. And you'll want to have turned in your seam allowance at the zipper opening 1/2 inch. And that includes the lining. And remember when we did the clean finish at the neckline? This is the side where we turn both seam allowances in 1/2 inch. So we're just going to continue that all the way down, turning in 1/2 inch. Now you're going to take your zipper, and you want to make sure it's a regular zipper, not invisible. And you're going to place it underneath that fold at center back. And you want the fold to be right next to your zipper teeth, but not covering your zipper teeth. And then you're going to be pinning through the dress seam allowances to the zipper tape below. You may find it helpful to use like a clear plastic ruler underneath your pinning so that you don't pin through your surface. You know, we're working on a padded sleeve board here, so it can just be a little extra helpful thing to do to have a plastic barrier beneath the 2 surfaces there, but you don't have to. You can see Andrea is doing just fine without it. And you're going to pin all the way down. We don't have to worry about matching anything on this side, right? On the next side, we'll worry about matching our waistline seam. But now we're just pinning. And there's a little excess zipper below the opening at the bottom. We're just making sure that the zipper can open all the way, that we haven't pinned too close. And now we're going to take this over to the machine. You want to start with your zipper at least halfway down and use a zipper foot. We use these old style zipper feet for our Bernina machines in the studio, and you can move the needle to either side of the zipper foot. You probably have one where you have to move the zipper foot to either side of the needle, but in any case, make sure that the side you have it on is allowing you to get as close to the zipper teeth as possible, stitching right on the edge of the fold. And when you get down to the pull, just stop with your needle down, close the zipper, and then continue on to the base of the zipper opening. So you'll see that is your first side, okay? That's the underlap side. And now we're going to move on to the overlap. Okay, so this is part 2 of step 14, inserting the lap zipper. So now we'll be sewing the overlap side, or the left side of the dress as you look at it. And you want to fold in your seam allowances 5/8 of an inch on this side. And then we're going to take that folded seam allowance and you're going to cover the zipper and cover your line of stitching that you just did on the underlap side. And what you're doing is you're pinning to the left of the zipper teeth, creating that little overlap. And you have to be very careful, again, not to pin through to your surface. You're just pinning through the 2 seam allowances to the zipper tape below. So you should be forming a little flap, and the pins are to the left of the zipper teeth here. Now you can open the zipper all the way. And you can see what Andrea is doing here is that she just does the last pin after opening the zipper because the pull at the top does create a little bit of bulk there that makes it hard to pin. And now we're going to stitch this overlap side. Now this side will have visible stitching. You can fold in the top of the zipper tape, but I usually just let it hang out and then fold it in and hand stitch in a following step. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're stitching the overlap side of the zipper, and the zipper pull is all the way open. And you are stitching starting at the back neckline, and you're using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance here. So we're stitching to the left of the zipper teeth and back stitching at the top. And again, just keep in mind that your stitching will be visible. This is a really beautiful vintage detail, but you want to be careful here. And so just create a nice taut surface by kind of guiding the fabric from the back a little bit. And now when you get down to the zipper pull, you're going to need to stop with your needle down and then close the zipper all the way. Now you won't have your guide on your throat plate here, so you just have to be really careful to continue stitching your line really straight at about 3/8 of an inch. And then we are going to stop with the needle down and pivot 90 degrees and stitch across the base of the zipper. Now, make sure you're not going to stitch over any metal parts of the zipper here, that your stop isn't underneath your stitching. Our zipper is a little longer than the zipper opening, so it's kind of hanging out below there. All right, so that is the overlap side of your zipper, and look how beautiful that looks. So now we will be able to move on to our finishing work. Next, we're going to show you how to attach the elastic permanently from the neckline to the back waist dart on the lining. Now, I would really recommend that you take this moment to try on your dress and make sure that the length of the elastic is right for you. The chart we gave you in the book is really just guidelines, right? So it may work for you, it may not, depending on the stretchiness of the elastic, your torso length, etc. So what I would recommend that you do is you take the elastic from the neckline and safety pin it to the back waist dart at the waistline seam. Try it on, see if it works, and if you need to adjust it, now is the time. Okay, and then what you're going to see in the next chapter is how to baste that elastic to the back lining of the bodice so that it then gets anchored to the back waistline as it's worn. Okay, so let's watch that part next. Okay, so now we are ready to attach the elastic on the inside of the dress. You can see we have our zipper installed, and on the lining at the back zipper opening, we have those seam allowances turned in the same amount that we did on the bodice, right? So on the underlap side, it's 5/8 of an inch. On the overlap side, it's 7/8 of an inch. And eventually we're going to turn in the waistline seam allowance and hand stitch it as well. But first, we need to attach the elastic. So you're going to grab those elastic ends, which are still free, and these are going to get tacked at the back darts on the lining, okay? So you're going to take the end of the elastic and making sure not to twist it, you're going to match it to the back dart. You want to match at the 5/8 of an inch seam line, okay? So at 5/8 of an inch in from the waistline raw edge, your elastic should be matching on top of the dart, the sewn dart. And you can see how when you pin it in place, you're sort of pulling the neckline down. And when worn, it will create that really beautiful pleat at the neckline. But the nice thing is it's really flexible, so the dress moves with you. Okay, so we're just going to pin each end of the elastic to the lining only. So just to confirm, you have already tried on the dress and confirmed your elastic length and adjusted if needed. Now, you can't try it on now because the elastic is going to be too free. The lining is not stitched in, right? So it's not going to do the thing it's supposed to do. So when you try it on, you have to actually safety pin it to the dress waistline to make sure that it's secure and working how it's going to be working when you wear the dress. Okay, all that said, now you're going to secure the elastic by stitching with your regular stitch length at about 2.5 millimeters. Stitch back and forth over it so it's very secure. Stitching to the lining only. Okay, so now your elastic is secure and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, we're still on step 15 here. We're just doing some finishing work. So what you're going to be doing is turning the seam allowance on the lining to the wrong side and pressing it. Now, if you have watched some of our other tutorials, one thing that we'll do sometimes, and it's actually my preferred way to do this, is to do a line of stay stitching around the waistline where we're turning it up now, just the lining, at 5/8 of an inch, and then you'll have a line stitched to turn up, so you won't have to be continually measuring it. So that's one way you can do it. It also reinforces the waistline a little bit, which I like. But either way is totally fine, whatever is your preferred way, but the important thing is that you turn in the seam allowance on the lining at the waistline, and you want to make sure that those center back seam allowances are still pressed in. And now we're going to pin this lining in place where you've just pressed it all the way around. So at the zipper tape and around the waistline seam. So you're concealing the waistline seam on the inside of the dress. And as you may have guessed, we're going to be hand stitching next. So this is going to take a little while. This is, you're going to do this while you're watching TV or something, but do some little slip stitches between the layers here to secure the lining to the waistline seam allowance and to the zipper tape at the center back opening. Okay, so that is your hand stitching holding the lining in place, and that's also going to hold that elastic stay in place. And then we just have the hem to do and the back straps, and then we are totally finished with this dress. Okay, so now we're on to step 16, which is sewing the straps. So I've tried this dress on, we confirmed the strap length, which you should do as well. And then you can see one side is sewn. These straps are sewn by hand. So you sew them, slip stitch them on the inside around the strap. See how nicely finished that looks? So around those little edges there, and then also along the upper edge on the outside of the dress, just little hidden slip stitches to hold that strap in place. Now, if you were like finishing this dress to wear to a party or something, and you only have a couple minutes and you have a pattern fabric like this, you could probably get away with machine stitching these straps in place along the upper edge there. But it does look really nice, and it's a really nice little couture detail to slip stitch them in place. And of course, we're only stitching to the lining here. You don't want your stitching to show on the right side of the dress. So catching a little bit of the lining and then stitching through the strap itself, through all the strap layers. So once you've stitched around the bottom of the strap on the inside of the dress, then we can flip it to the right side and do some slip stitches between the back neckline of the dress and the strap, just to hold that in place there. And on this side, just be careful that you're working between the layers and sort of hiding your stitches in between the layers. And then that's it. Your straps are attached. And we'll move on to the very final step, which is hemming your dress. So Andrea's just going to knot off on the inside of the lining here. Just really secure it. You can't secure these stitches too much because straps do get a lot of wear and tear, so just make sure that you are feeling very confident in your stitching here. And you can go over it again if you need to. So there's your completed bodice. Look how beautiful that is. And now our final step is the hem. So we're going to stitch around the slit and then around the bottom of the dress in the next chapter. Okay, step 17, the last step of this dress is to hem it. So you're going to want to try the dress on, or hopefully you've made a muslin and you know the length you want it to be and you've made any adjustments. But this does have an inch included hem allowance. So Andrea is turning this up a full inch at the hem and pressing all the way around. Our skirts tend to be a little longer. We draft them for a 5'6" model. That would be me. And also, I like things to be on the longer side because they have a more vintage look that way, but that may not be your preference. So you may find that the skirt is a little too long for you, especially if you're shorter than that. So just make sure you're happy with the length. But here we are turning it up an inch, pinning in place, and making sure that the slit seam allowances are pressed in as well and pinned as well. Now again, you're wearing this to a party in 5 minutes. You can just run this hem through your sewing machine if you're happy with that. We really wanted to show you the more couture ways of doing things in this book, so we are hand stitching. So Andrea's going to be using essentially a whip stitch, right? You can use a slip stitch as well, but we'll show you a little bit of a different way. You're going to tack your thread in place by stitching in the same place a couple times in a row. And then you're just going to take the tiniest little thread of your outer fabric of your dress above the hem, making sure that you can't really see it because you really just want to grab one little thread. And then you're going to come across to the hem allowance itself and put your needle through the hem allowance completely. And then continue down like that. Now, you have to be really careful not to pull your thread too tight, right? You don't want any tension on your thread and you don't want to be pulling on each stitch because then you will get puckers on the right side of your fabric. You probably wouldn't be able to tell on this very bold print in linen, but let's say you had a solid colored satin fabric. You would be able to see every little pucker, right? So you're going to want to be really careful to just take the littlest thread of the outer fabric of the dress itself and to not pull tightly when you're stitching. And again, this is a nice task for having a nice cup of tea, turning on your favorite show, podcast, and just taking your time with this. Got a little tangled thread there. It's a good idea, if you're not as comfortable with hand stitching, keep your thread lengths really short, right? So you can measure from your fingertips to your elbow, and that should be the maximum length you're using. And then you can see you can't see it from the outside at all. So you're going to continue like that, stitching all the way around the hem. And then your dress will be complete. So there it is, your beautiful finished Camille sheath. Okay, everyone, that is it, your Camille sheath. I just love the clever neckline detail on this dress and that sculpted pocket ease on the skirt as well. Now, keep in mind that this is a great bodice to add any other skirt to. So for instance, you could do a simple gathered skirt, a circle skirt, or in the book, I show you how to do a hack, which is an all-around full pleated skirt. I can't wait to see your version of the Camille sheath. So please do tag me on Instagram at Gertie18, and you can use the hashtags Camille sheath and Charmed Sewing Studio. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget you can find those links to the other book videos in the description, the Lillian jacket and the Madeline dress. I will see you next time. Goodbye.